know who Jack the Ripper really was? Was Jack the Ripper perhaps another serial killer named H.H. Holmes? I talked to Jeff Mudgett, great-great-grandson of H.H. Holmes, who has his own ideas.
You know, I've been doing this, Peter, for years, and I've never had anyone ask me that, strange as it may sound. There's a stigma, all right? People look at you strange. There's no doubt they're fascinated with my origins. There's a thing, maybe, I don't know about Canada, but in America particularly, about serial killers, about murder, about why any human being could make those kinds of decisions, especially one which I think history is agreeing wasn't sociopathic, but mostly psychopathic. I'm not a therapist, I'm not a psychologist. I don't know if I could accurately state why they're coming to those conclusions, but I knew I was different, Peter, from a very young age, all right? I just never found out about my great-great-grandfather till I was about 40, when my grandfather told the family the secret that he'd kept hidden, even from my grandma, for most of his life. And that's why I decided to write the book. History Channel had watched me perform my TED Talk, and they'd heard me interviewed by George Norrie on Coast to Coast Radio, and they were fascinated with the story. They contacted me through a production outfit in New York City called Mudgett, and they wanted to know more about my theory that Holmes might have also been Jack the Ripper. They performed an episode of Haunted History. It was just on yesterday, as a matter of fact, on History Channel, called The Murder Castle. And at the end of the episode, they actually brought up my theory that he could have been the Ripper. And I guess there was someone there, Peter, I never met as in shaking hands with an executive at History. But there was someone there who was fascinated with the story, and they ran with it. I have some pictures. I've got his graduation photograph from med school at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, with his signature on the back, which, you know, I prize. As far as, you know, knives or hats or things like that, no, I don't. There's some debate over that. He's, you know, the trouble you have, and I'm sure your students are aware of this, Peter, you're aware of it, I know, but the newspaper articles were dealing with, you know, while he was alive during his trial, which was probably the most widely followed criminal trial in American history, except maybe Aaron Burr's, that assassination attempt. But Holmes was covered by every major newspaper in the country. The courtroom was full. But the stories that came out about Holmes, there was quite a bit of yellow journalism. And when you write, say, most of the authors that have written books about Holmes, including The Devil in the White City, the very famous story by Eric Larson, they they like, and I'm sure you're aware of other history like this too, Peter. They like to call it nonfiction because they pick it up off a newspaper article and they assume that it was verified, the facts. And I'm finding out more and more, Peter, they weren't. And that's why I decided to call my book Fiction Based on a True Story, because I can't verify much of the story about Holmes, including how intelligent he was and where he graduated in his class at the University of Michigan Medical School. There's some that say he was up high in the class, and there are some that say he barely graduated. We do know that he rarely attended classes. He was out in business. We do know that he'd show up the day of a test, upsetting his professors, but then pass one of the exams with a C, enough to get by. And, you know, obviously they wouldn't have allowed him to graduate as a doctor had he not had some level of intelligence, which I think probably was high. It's just he wasn't particularly concerned where he graduated in his class. He just wanted to get out into the world and do his thing. Oh, con man. Con man. Yeah, you know, there's a quote that I carry with me in the back of my head everywhere I go. It's the one by the Chicago Tribune. You know, and you've got to understand, Chicago was the center of America at that time. It was where everything was flowing down through the Great Lakes, out of Canada, back through the East Coast. It was the center of where the West was moving out toward California, all those things. And the Chicago Tribune, once they researched his story, once they found out what had been going on in the middle of their great city, in the middle of the World's Fair, once they found out the evil that he was, they called him, you know, the greatest con that ever struck Chicago. Oh, he was a master at manipulating other people. He was as charismatic. He had a character that the women adored. He had an ability to talk men like you and me into doing things they wouldn't have dreamed of. And he seemed to have this ability to walk into a bank, to walk into a government office, to walk into a law enforcement office and talk people who had trained, you know, to make a living in recognizing frauds like him. And he was just better at it than they were. He enjoyed cheating. He enjoyed having 3 or 4 wives at the same time. Many mistresses. We don't know the number. That's every show I go on, there's someone that wants to argue that number. And I pretty much step out of those arguments now, Peter, about how many mistresses he had, how many people he murdered. I don't know. I just know that he fit the definition we use today to define a serial killer and a mass murderer, which is enough for me. And the exact number, while I wish those people would reach some kind of closure wherever they are, I doubt that's ever going to happen. I still stand by the argument I made at the TED in Vancouver. I still back up those pieces of evidence I laid out, trying to argue the crowd of 3,000 people to my side. And what was unique about my TED talk was that at the end, the the manager of the event, gave out devices for the crowd to vote whether they believed my arguments or not, and thought that the evidence was powerful. And we came up with a pretty high percentage that were going to open up their minds, change the biases they had about Jack the Ripper, and consider what I was saying. And the piece of evidence that I think moved most of them, Peter, was the computer analysis of the handwriting. We compared Holmes's handwriting with the Dear Boss letter, and we took it to the University of Buffalo, to a corporation there called Cedar Fox, which is a company full of brilliant computer geniuses that the CIA uses, the FBI uses, Scotland Yard uses. And I was surprised. I just walked in and asked them if they'd be willing to do this for me. And they said, yeah. And they ran it through the computer, and we put the results up on the screen in Vancouver. And while they didn't come out to say, we are definitive that this is the same handwriting, there are portions here that we used, and the data that we would have taken to the FBI or to the CIA or to Scotland Yard, and we're in the 90 percentiles. And they came back to me and said, you know, do you have some backing, financial backing? We'd like to change the program on the computer to match the fonts that were prevalent at that time in the 1880s, and then rerun it through the computer. So while I was out trying to do that, I had a friend in Chicago that worked for one of the newspapers there and TV news channels, who, despite my asking him not to, ran the story with the data from Cedar Fox. And as you might imagine, Cedar Fox was quite upset, and they pretty much sealed me off from any further contact with them because of that, which is something I've been disappointed with for a long time. But there's something there. And when it went up on the screen in Vancouver, and the special effects there were amazing. And they ran the comparison of the handwriting up in front of the audience, merged them together. And I basically asked the audience, Peter, I said, okay, you know, I used to do this for a living. I can find you a handwriting expert that says this is a definitive match. Or I can find you a handwriting expert that says, no way, this isn't the same man's handwriting. That's the way criminal law and handwriting expert testimony unfortunately works. I said, but you've seen what a computer said about it. Now put all that aside and look at it with your own eyes. Just look. The entire crowd went silent. And then their heads started nodding. Then you could see, just looking at those comparisons of the yours truly on the Dear Boss and the yours truly when Herman wrote it on his own letters. It was a seller, and I'll never forget that moment. Presented to the world. I mean, American Ripper was shown in the UK, Australia, South Africa, Canada, America, all over. I mean, the last episode had 2 million viewers. That's in America. I presented to the world my theory that Holmes was Jack the Ripper, and my evidence that I think proves that he was at least the killer of Catherine Eddowes and the author of Dear Boss and Saucy Jack, okay? I don't have any evidence tying him to Mary Kelly. I don't have any evidence tying him to Annie Chapman, any of those. I'm comfortable where I am right now with that. And I know when anyone presents a new suspect regarding Jack the Ripper, it's one of the most It's one of the most challenging places to be in our world because the ripperologists will swarm. And I don't know if they even want to know who really is Jack the Ripper, Peter, if it doesn't match who they think their suspect is. All right? That's what the TED was about. Bias and preconceived notions, about opening your mind to new evidence and considering something which you've already made a decision about. It was a great program, great speakers. And, you know, that's what I face when I go places to talk about Jack and Herman. You know, I try to explain to them, my co-host on American Ripper did all the research regarding passenger lists and him riding ships to London. I stayed away from that because I knew that if I got anywhere within a mile of those things, they would just say, no, that's just Mudgett trying to prove his point to sell his books. Okay. That's the way the world works these days with book, when you have a book, when you're on a TV show, any of those. But I got to tell you, I think it's very interesting to know the world is coming around to that latest piece regarding that Dear Boss and Saucy Jack were written by the same hand. When you cross that bridge, when you reach that hurdle and surpass it, I think you're very, very close to eliminating any possibility of a hoax any longer. When Dear Boss predicts what's going to happen and Saucy Jack describes the crime scene before law enforcement released either one to the public, you're getting very close to the author of those two being the killer. And if not that, Peter, you would have had a very small number of journalists that could have written those two regarding that murder. Certainly the police could have run down who that journalist trying to create that hoax could have been. So I'm very comfortable that I've come up with a piece of evidence that probably proves that Dear Boss wasn't a hoax, that the author of Dear Boss was the murderer of Catherine Eddowes. Elizabeth Stride, you know, that argument about whether it was possible for him to run across town and kill twice in 40 minutes, I don't know. But, you know, I'm very comfortable with that. And I think with classes like yours, with knowledge like you have, with the forensic science evolving where it's going, I think one day it'll be proven. And, you know, you've got to admit, American Ripper and the people at History, Peter, they gave me the opportunity to have my DNA tested. They tried to pull up the DNA from the quote-unquote shawl, Catherine Eddowes shawl. There was at least an attempt to pull up direct evidence rather than just another author writing another book. So I'm proud of that. You know, Peter, thanks for this opportunity. I try not to sell hard when I'm trying to, you know, doing my best to change history and represent my family's position in this whole horrible thing. But there's been numerous books on H.H. Holmes. Mine is from a unique perspective of a man who, at 40 years old, was explained by his grandfather that, you know, we came from a different place. We came from maybe one of the most evil characters in American history. A genius who could have been a Louis Pasteur had he wanted to, Peter, that decided to go the other way. And what I was trying to do in my book, Peter, instead of just explaining how many people H.H. Holmes murdered at the murder factory, how he would strip flesh from skeletons to sell them to medical schools across the country, how he was maybe the most practiced con at life insurance fraud that ever lived. That's how he made his living. I wanted to explain to the world what it meant to me, how it changed my life, knowing that that's where I came from. That's his conscious decisions, Peter, were why I'm talking with you in your class here today. And that's not an easy place to be. It's not. I'd much rather would have had it been Abraham Lincoln, okay? Instead, I've got the evil genius of American history who designed the murder factory to rape and kill innocent young ladies who had come to visit the World's Fair, to see the Wright brothers, to see Tesla, to see Einstein, to see everything that was being invented at that time. And that's at a time when technology was exploding across the world. And that's where it was showcased to millions. 27 million tickets were sold. And 2 miles down the road was this premeditated factory of death. So that's what the book's about. That's why I let all my readers know this isn't about describing how he would slice an abdomen open, how he would remove a liver, a kidney, an ovary. This was about the thought processes that I went through. Like I said before, having known I was different from when I was a little boy, and then being given an answer by my grandfather. The Holmes curse is perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the entire story. I'm being contacted day after day now, Peter, from independent filmmakers who want to make a movie centered around the trial, the courtroom drama, and then the Holmes curse, if it's proven, or if it's established, or if it's just pointed out that he did escape execution, he wasn't buried there, and that he went back to visit those that had upset him, being arrested, being incarcerated, being tried, and being held in prison. And when you run down the list, the jury foreman, the prosecuting attorney, the prison superintendent, one of his wives who testified against him, on and on. I think Adam Selzer came up with a number of about 31 who suffered death or terrible misfortune, who had been connected with Holmes in some way during his arrest, incarceration, trial, and execution. And I think I tried to capture it in the book. I tried to capture a scene where Holmes would have visited the judge at the judge's house late one night, and maybe they took the trial from a different perspective back and forth then. But the Holmes curse, I think, is going to be opened up. I think you've got Paramount and Hulu now owning the rights to The Devil in the White City. I think they've got millions and millions of dollars and brilliant research technicians, or whatever they call them, that are going to open the Holmes story up to see how complex it actually is. It's much, much more complex than what the world knows right now. I mean, we're starting to uncover that there was a criminal cabal where he had assistants across the country who communicated on newspaper articles using a code. That code couldn't be broken by the Attorney General and the prosecuting attorney in Philadelphia before the trial, who wanted to use some of his correspondence as evidence. They actually called Scotland Yard over to help them break that code. And those are the type of things that continue to open up regarding this complex man. And I got to tell you, I can't wait to see what Martin Scorsese, Leo DiCaprio, and Paramount come up with regarding this fantastic story.